The widow Mary Foster first saw the cowboy through the canvas wall of her tent, when his shadow fell across her makeshift home like a promise she had not dared to hope for. It was August of 1882 in the New Mexico Territory, just outside the dusty settlement of Los Alamos, and the desert heat made even breathing feel like an act of defiance against the unforgiving land. Mary stood at 24 years old, her hands rough from work that no proper lady back east would have recognized as feminine. Her husband James had been dead for 6 months, caught in a flash flood while trying to rescue their livestock. The water had taken him, the animals, their small cabin, and nearly everything they owned. All that remained was this patched tent, a few cooking implements, and the fierce determination that burned in Mary's chest like the sun overhead. She pushed back the canvas flap and stepped outside, squinting against the bright afternoon light. The shadow belonged to a tall man sitting astride a chestnut mare, his hat pulled low against the glare. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who had spent more time in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep and steady, the kind of voice that made you believe whatever came after it. "Name's Thomas Lawson. I've been working cattle drives between here and Kansas, but I'm looking to settle for a spell. Word in town is you might have work available." Mary straightened her spine and met his gaze. His eyes were the color of sage after rain, green-gray and serious. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a perpetually questioning expression. He looked to be in his late 20s, with sun-darkened skin and the lean build of a man who worked hard and ate whatever the trail provided. "Word travels fast," Mary said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I do have work, Mr. Lawson, though I cannot pay much. My land still produces, but I need help building proper structures and managing what stock I've managed to acquire since my husband passed. Room and board, plus a small wage when I can manage it." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes taking in the tent, the small garden Mary had coaxed from the stubborn earth, and the makeshift corral that held 2 goats and a cow. "That tent won't survive another winter," he said simply. "Not with the winds that blow through here." "I am aware," Mary replied, lifting her chin. She hated the defensive tone that crept into her voice, hated that this stranger could so easily identify her vulnerability. "I have plans to build before winter comes." "Building takes time and skill," Thomas said, and there was no judgment in his tone, only observation. "I've built 3 cabins, helped construct a barn for my brother in Colorado, and worked enough odd jobs to know which end of a hammer to hold. If you're willing, I'll take the job. And the first thing we'll do is get you out of that tent." Mary felt something crack in her chest, some wall she had built brick by stubborn brick since James died. She blinked rapidly and turned away, pretending to examine her garden. "Very well. You can put your horse in the corral. There's a spot behind the tent where you can set up your bedroll. Supper is at sundown." "Yes, madam," Thomas said, and she heard him lead his horse away. That first evening, Mary cooked beans and cornbread over her small fire while Thomas tended to his mare and arranged his camp. He worked quietly, efficiently, asking permission before touching anything that belonged to her. When the food was ready, they sat on opposite sides of the fire, the flames creating dancing shadows between them. "How did you come to be here?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence with the question Mary had been dreading. She could have given him the short version, the bare facts that would satisfy curiosity without revealing too much. Instead, she found herself telling him everything. She spoke of meeting James in St. Louis, of his dreams of building something of their own in the West. She described their journey to New Mexico, the back-breaking work of establishing their small ranch, the joy of their first successful harvest. And then she told him about the storm, about watching the wall of water come down the canyon, about screaming James's name until her voice gave out. Thomas listened without interrupting, his face grave in the firelight. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My wife died of fever 3 years ago. We'd been married 6 months. Some days it feels like another lifetime. Other days it's like it just happened." Mary looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw the grief that lived behind his eyes. It was different from hers, but no less real. "I am sorry," she whispered. "So am I," he replied. "For both of us." They sat in comfortable silence after that, two people who understood that some losses could not be mended, only carried. The next morning Thomas was up before dawn. Mary woke to the sound of him moving around outside, and when she emerged from her tent, she found him surveying the land with a critical eye. He had a notebook in his hand and was sketching something. "Coffee's on the fire," Mary said, and he looked up with a slight smile. "Thank you. I've been thinking about your house. There's a good spot over there near that rise. It'll catch the morning sun but have shade in the afternoon, close enough to water but high enough to avoid flooding." Mary walked over to stand beside him, looking at the spot he indicated. She could see it, the house she had dreamed of building with James, the home that had been swept away before it could take root. "It's perfect," she said softly. "We'll need lumber," Thomas continued, all business now. "Stone for the foundation. Adobe would work well here, and we can make the bricks ourselves. It'll take time, but it'll last." "I have some money saved," Mary said. "Not much, but enough to buy supplies. There's a sawmill in Santa Fe about a day's ride from here." Thomas nodded. "I'll head there tomorrow, get what we need to start. In the meantime, we should work on improving your livestock situation. 2 goats and a cow won't sustain you through winter." They spent the morning walking the property, discussing what needed to be done. Mary found herself talking more freely than she had in months, sharing her ideas and listening to Thomas's suggestions. He treated her as an equal partner in the planning, never dismissing her opinions or talking down to her. It was a kind of respect James had given her, but few other men did. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Thomas rode to Santa Fe and returned with lumber, bags of cement, and various tools. They began making adobe bricks, mixing mud and straw, pouring the mixture into wooden frames and leaving them to bake in the relentless sun. It was hard, hot work, and Mary's back ached every night, but there was satisfaction in watching the bricks pile up, knowing each one brought her closer to having a real home again. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk. Thomas told her about his life on the cattle drives, the endless plains of grass, the storms that could spook a whole herd, the camaraderie of the cowboys and the loneliness of the night watch. Mary spoke of her childhood in Missouri, of learning to read from her mother's precious books, of the shock of coming west and realizing how different everything was from what she had imagined. One night, about 2 weeks after Thomas arrived, a group of riders came through. Mary heard them before she saw them, the thunder of hooves making her heart race with old fear. Thomas was on his feet in an instant, his hand moving to the rifle that leaned against his bedroll. 3 men reined in their horses near the tent. They were rough-looking characters with the hard eyes of men who lived on the edges of the law. The leader, a heavy man with a tobacco-stained beard, grinned down at them. "Well now, what do we have here? A woman alone in the desert. That's dangerous, madam." "Lucky for you, we're offering protection services." "The lady's not alone," Thomas said quietly, stepping forward. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "And she doesn't need your services." The bearded man's eyes flicked to Thomas, assessing. "1 cowboy and a woman. Still seems like you could use some help. These are dangerous parts. The lady's under my protection, Thomas said, and though he had not raised his voice, the words carried weight. I'd suggest you ride on. For a tense moment, Mary thought they might push it. Her hand moved to the knife she kept at her belt, the one James had given her. But then the leader shrugged, perhaps seeing something in Thomas's stance that warned him off. No offense meant, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. We'll be on our way. They rode off, and Mary let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Thomas stayed watchful until they were out of sight, then turned to her. You should stay close to the tent for the next few days, he said. Men like that sometimes come back. Thank you, Mary said, and she meant it. For standing up for me. You hired me to help you, Thomas replied. That means more than just building, though we should probably get that house up faster. Walls are better than canvas for keeping trouble out. After that night, something shifted between them. Mary found herself watching Thomas as he worked, noticing the way his muscles moved under his shirt, the concentration on his face when he measured and cut wood. She told herself it was simply appreciation for a job well done, but her heart knew better. Thomas seemed to feel it too. She caught him looking at her sometimes, his expression unguarded for just a moment before he turned away. Neither of them spoke of it. The memory of their lost spouses stood between them like a wall neither was ready to breach. The foundation of the house went up first, stones carefully placed and mortared. Then the walls began to rise, adobe bricks stacked with precision. Thomas worked from dawn to dusk, pausing only for meals and water. Mary helped where she could, learning to mix mortar, to hand him tools, to understand the logic of construction. You're a natural at this, Thomas said one afternoon, as Mary successfully completed a corner joint he had shown her. I had a good teacher, she replied, and their eyes met for a moment longer than necessary. One evening in late September, as the brutal summer heat was finally beginning to ease, Mary was preparing supper when she heard Thomas curse. She looked up to see him clutching his hand, blood seeping between his fingers. What happened? She asked, rushing over. Slipped with the saw, he said through gritted teeth. It is not bad. Let me see, Mary demanded, and he reluctantly held out his hand. The cut was deep, running along his palm. You need this cleaned and bandaged. Come here. She led him to the fire where the light was better and retrieved her medical supplies, another thing she had learned to keep well stocked in this unforgiving land. Thomas sat quietly as she cleaned the wound with whiskey, his jaw clenched against the pain. You're good at this, he observed, watching her work. I've had practice, Mary said softly. Out here, you learn to tend your own wounds. There's rarely a doctor close enough to matter. As she wrapped his hand with clean cloth, her fingers gentle against his calloused palm, she felt the warmth of him, the solidness. When she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Mary, he said, and her name had never sounded like that before, like something precious. Yes, she whispered, but whatever he had been about to say was interrupted by the sound of a wagon approaching. They both stood, the moment breaking like glass. The wagon belonged to their nearest neighbor, Mrs. Sarah Jenkins, a widow herself who lived 5 miles east with her 2 sons. Mary, Sarah called, climbing down from the wagon seat with surprising agility for a woman of 60. I heard you had help finally. Came to see for myself. Mary made introductions, and Sarah looked Thomas up and down with the frank appraisal of someone who had lived too long to care about being subtle. Good bones, she pronounced. And I can see he's actually building something, not just talking about it. You hold on to this one, Mary. Mary felt her face flush, but Thomas just smiled politely and excused himself to continue work on the house. Sarah turned to Mary with knowing eyes. I see how you look at each other, she said quietly, like you are scared of your own feelings. Sarah, he's only been here a month. And James has only been gone for 7 months. It is too soon, says who? Sarah demanded. Your husband would want you to be happy, Mary. The dead don't begrudge the living their chance at life, and this land is too hard to face alone. I know. Sarah had lost her husband 10 years earlier and had never remarried, though she had admirers. Why did you never marry again? Mary asked. Because I never found anyone who made me feel what you are clearly feeling for that cowboy, Sarah replied. Don't make my mistake, child. Don't let fear keep you from happiness. After Sarah left, Mary thought about her words. That night, as she and Thomas sat by the fire, she found herself stealing glances at him, wondering what he was thinking. The house should be ready in another 3 weeks, Thomas said, breaking the silence. We'll need to make furniture, but at least you will have solid walls and a roof before the cold sets in. What will you do then? Mary asked, the question spilling out before she could stop it. Once the house is finished, I mean. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. I had not thought that far ahead, he finally said. I suppose I will look for other work in the area, or maybe join another cattle drive come spring. You could stay, Mary said, her heart pounding. There's plenty of work here. The ranch will not run itself, and I cannot manage it alone. I could pay you properly once we start producing again. Thomas looked at her across the fire, his eyes searching her face. Is that what you want, for me to stay? Mary took a breath, feeling like she stood at the edge of a cliff. Yes, she said simply. I want you to stay. Then I will, he replied, and something in his voice made Mary's heart soar. The house took shape day by day. The walls reached their full height, and Thomas began work on the roof. Mary watched from below, her heart in her throat every time he climbed the ladder. The structure had 2 rooms, a main living space with a fireplace and a smaller bedroom. It was modest, but to Mary, it was a palace. On a cool October morning, Thomas called her over. Come see, he said, and there was excitement in his voice. Mary climbed the ladder he had set against the wall and emerged onto the flat roof. The view took her breath away. From here, she could see for miles, the desert stretching out in shades of red and gold, the mountains purple in the distance. It is beautiful, she whispered. It is, Thomas agreed, but when she looked at him, he was not looking at the view. He was looking at her. Thomas, she began, but he shook his head gently. Let me say this, he said. I came here looking for work, nothing more. I thought I would help you build a house and then move on, same as I always do. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being just a job. You stopped being just an employer. Mary's heart was beating so hard she thought he must hear it. What am I then? She asked softly. You're the reason I wake up eager to start the day, he said. You're the last thing I think about before I sleep. You're brave and strong and beautiful, and I have been falling in love with you since the day I watched you stand up to those riders with nothing but a knife and your courage. Tears pricked Mary's eyes. I have been fighting it, she admitted, feeling this way, telling myself it was too soon, that I was betraying James's memory. And now, Thomas asked, taking a step closer. Now I think Sarah was right. James would want me to be happy, and you make me happy, Thomas. You make me feel alive again, like there's still a future worth building. She reached out and took his hand, the one she had bandaged, now healing cleanly. I love you too. Thomas pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with a tenderness that made her want to cry. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, and finally her lips. It was a kiss that held all the longing of the past weeks, all the fear and hope and promise of something new. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Thomas grinned. We should probably finish the house before we get too distracted, he said. Mary laughed, the sound bright and free. Yes, probably. But finishing the house suddenly felt like the beginning of something rather than an ending. The work continued, but now there was joy in it. They talked as they worked, making plans for the future. Thomas wanted to expand the livestock, maybe get some chickens and a few more cattle. Mary wanted to plant a larger garden in the spring, maybe try growing some vegetables to sell in Los Alamos. "We could make this place really prosper," Thomas said one evening as they reviewed their plans. "Build it into something lasting." "Our home," Mary said, testing the words. "Our home," Thomas agreed, and the way he said it made it real. The house was completed in late October, just as the first cold winds began to blow down from the mountains. Thomas built a bed frame and a table, chairs and shelves. Mary sewed curtains from fabric she bought in town, using her mother's old sewing kit. She hung them in the windows Thomas had so carefully fitted, and the house suddenly felt like home. The night before she was to move out of the tent, Thomas came to her as she was cooking dinner. "I have something to ask you," he said, and there was nervousness in his voice that she had never heard before. "What is it?" Mary asked, setting down her spoon. Thomas knelt down on one knee, pulling a small wooden box from his pocket. "I made this myself," he said, opening it to reveal a ring carved from dark wood, polished until it gleamed. "It is not fancy, but it is made with my hands and my heart. Mary Foster, will you marry me? Will you let me be your husband and build our life together in the home we have created?" Mary felt tears stream down her face. She had never expected to feel this way again, to have another chance at the kind of love she had shared with James. But this was different, forged in shared work and understanding, born from two hearts that had known loss and were brave enough to try again. "Yes," she said, pulling Thomas to his feet. "Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he kissed her, and Mary felt like she was finally, truly home. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Los Alamos. Sarah Jenkins stood as witness, along with several townspeople who had come to know Mary during her months of hardship. The minister, an elderly man who had seen his share of desert weddings, pronounced them husband and wife with genuine warmth. "May you build a good life together," he said, and Thomas replied, "We already have started." That night, they returned to their house. Thomas carried Mary over the threshold, both of them laughing. He set her down gently in the main room, lit by the warm glow of the fireplace he had built. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lawson," he said softly. "This is our home," Mary replied, looking around at the solid walls, the sturdy roof, the windows that let in the starlight. "You built it for us." "We built it together," Thomas corrected, pulling her close. "Everything from here on we do together." That night, as they lay together in their bed in their house, Mary felt a peace she had not known since James died. The grief would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had been given a second chance, and she was determined not to waste it. The winter came, fierce and cold, but the house stood strong against it. The walls were thick and well built, the roof tight, the fireplace efficient. Thomas and Mary spent the long evenings planning for spring, reading from Mary's precious books and learning the rhythms of being married. It was different from her first marriage, and Mary tried not to compare, but there were times when memories surfaced. Thomas never seemed bothered by it. "He was your husband," he said one night when Mary had been quiet, lost in thought. "He'll always be a part of your story." "I'm not trying to erase him. I just want to be part of the next chapter." "You are not just part of it," Mary said, taking his hand. "You are writing it with me." Spring brought new life to the desert. Mary's garden flourished under her careful tending, and Thomas built proper pens for the expanded livestock. He had traded work with neighbors and managed to acquire 6 chickens, 2 more cows, and a young bull. The ranch was beginning to look prosperous. One morning in April, Mary woke feeling queasy. She tried to hide it, but Thomas noticed immediately. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "I am fine," Mary said, but the nausea rolled through her again. And then suddenly she knew. She looked up at Thomas, eyes wide. "I think I might be with child." Thomas's face went through several emotions in rapid succession before settling on pure joy. "Truly," he whispered, "I think so. It is too early to be certain, but the signs are there." He gathered her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she might break. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Our baby." Mary felt tears on her cheeks, but they were happy tears. This child would be a new beginning, a symbol of the life they were building together. The pregnancy was confirmed by Sarah Jenkins, who had served as midwife for most of the births in the area. "You are definitely expecting," she said with a smile. "I would say you are due around December, right before Christmas." Thomas became almost comically protective. He would not let Mary lift anything heavy, insisted she rest more, and worried constantly about her health. Mary found it both touching and occasionally frustrating. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she told him one day when he tried to prevent her from carrying a bucket of water from the well. "I know," he said, looking sheepish. "I just want to make sure you and the baby are safe." Mary softened, taking his hand. "We are safe. You have made sure of that, but I also need to keep working to feel useful." They found a compromise, with Mary doing lighter tasks and Thomas taking on the heavier work. The ranch continued to thrive under their joint efforts. By midsummer, they were selling eggs and vegetables in Los Alamos, making enough money to be comfortable. One day in July, a stranger rode up to the house. He was well dressed by frontier standards with a leather portfolio under his arm. "Are you Thomas Lawson?" he called out. Thomas emerged from the barn, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that hung by the door. "I am. Who is asking?" "Name's Robert Clark. I'm a land agent. I've been trying to locate you for some time now." "Do you have a brother named Daniel Lawson in Colorado?" Thomas's face went pale. "I do. Is he all right?" "I'm afraid he passed away 2 months ago. A riding accident. I'm sorry for your loss." The man pulled papers from his portfolio. "He left you his property, a ranch outside of Denver, quite substantial. I have the deed here." Thomas took the papers with shaking hands. Mary came out of the house, seeing the distress on his face. "What has happened?" she asked. "My brother Daniel is dead," Thomas said, his voice hollow. He looked at the papers, then at their house, at Mary. "He left me his ranch." The agent cleared his throat. "It is a valuable property, Mr. Lawson, worth a considerable sum if you chose to sell it. Or you could move there and run it yourself. Either way, you are now a wealthy man." After the agent left, Thomas and Mary sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Mary spoke. "What do you want to do?" "I do not know," Thomas admitted. "Daniel and I were close once. We had not spoken in 3 years, not since Rachel died. I said some things, he said some things. I always thought we would have time to mend it." "I am sorry," Mary said, taking his hand. "I know that pain." Thomas looked at her, at their house, at the land they had worked so hard to improve. "This is our home," he said. "I built it with you. Whatever that ranch in Colorado is worth, it cannot compare to what we have here." "We could sell it," Mary suggested. "Use the money to make this place even better." Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes, that is what we will do. I will go to Colorado, settle Daniel's affairs, and come back. To you, to our home." "How long will you be gone?" Mary asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. The baby would be born in 5 months, and the thought of Thomas being away made her anxious. "A month, maybe less if I can manage it. I will leave next week, after I make sure everything here is secure for you." The next few days were a flurry of preparation. Thomas made arrangements with neighbors to check on Mary regularly, stocked the house with supplies, and went over every detail of running the ranch. He was clearly torn between duty to his brother's memory and the desire to stay with Mary. On the morning he was to leave, Mary walked him out to where his horse waited, packed and ready. "Be careful," she said, reaching up to touch his face. "Come back to me." "Always," he promised, kissing her deeply. He placed his hand on her belly, which was just beginning to show. "Take care of our little one. I will be back before you know it." Mary watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the vast landscape. When he was finally out of sight, she returned to the house, to the home they had built together, and tried not to count the days until his return. The weeks without Thomas were the longest of Mary's life. She threw herself into work, tending the garden, caring for the animals, maintaining the house. Sarah visited regularly, providing company and checking on the pregnancy. "You are doing well," Sarah assured her during one visit. "The baby is strong and so are you. That cowboy of yours will be back soon, mark my words." 3 weeks after Thomas left, Mary was in town buying supplies when she overheard two men talking. "Heard there was trouble up in Colorado," one of them said. "Some kind of property dispute. Fellow got shot over it." Mary's heart stopped. She approached them immediately. "Excuse me, what were you talking about? What happened in Colorado?" The men looked uncomfortable. "It was just talk, madam, probably nothing to do with anyone you know." But Mary could not shake the fear. That night she lay awake in their bed, staring at the ceiling Thomas had so carefully constructed, and prayed for his safety. 4 weeks after he left, almost to the day, Mary heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. She ran to the window, her heart in her throat. It was Thomas. He looked exhausted, covered in trail dust, but he was whole and alive. Mary flew out the door and into his arms, not caring about propriety or dignity. Thomas held her tight, burying his face in her hair. "I was so worried," Mary sobbed. "I heard there was trouble in Colorado, and I thought something had happened to you." "I am fine," Thomas assured her, though his face was grim. "There was trouble, but not for me. Daniel's partner tried to claim the ranch was his. We had to go through the courts, which took longer than expected. But it is settled now. I sold the ranch and we have enough money to build a real life here." He pulled a bank draft from his pocket. Mary looked at the amount and gasped. "Thomas, this is a fortune." "It is our fortune," he corrected. "Ours and our child's. We can build this ranch into something substantial now. We can hire help, expand properly, maybe even buy the adjoining land. Whatever you want." Mary kissed him, long and deep. "What I want is you here safe. The money is wonderful, but you are what matters." That night, as they lay together, Thomas told her about Colorado, about settling his brother's affairs, about the legal battle and the final sale. "I kept thinking about this house," he said, "about how we built it together from nothing. That ranch in Colorado was impressive, but it was not ours, not the way this place is. Every board, every brick in these walls represents something we did together. This is our home." Over the next months, as Mary's pregnancy advanced, they used some of the money to improve the ranch. They hired 2 ranch hands, young men who were willing to work hard. They expanded the house, adding 2 more rooms and a proper porch. They bought more livestock and built a real barn. But through all the expansion and improvement, the heart of their home remained that original structure. The house Thomas had built for Mary when she was living in a tent. The home that had become the foundation of their new life together. In December, on a cold, clear night, Mary went into labor. Sarah came immediately, bringing her experience and calm presence. Thomas paced outside, unable to sit still, listening to the sounds from within and feeling helpless. When the baby's cry finally pierced the night, Thomas burst through the door. Sarah met him with a smile. "You have a son," she announced. "A healthy, loud boy." Mary lay exhausted in their bed, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. When she saw Thomas, she smiled. "Come meet your son." Thomas approached slowly, reverently, and looked down at the small red face. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making his displeasure at the world known with impressive volume. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered, tears streaming down his face. "What should we call him?" Mary had been thinking about this. "What was your brother's middle name?" "James," Thomas said, and then he understood. "You want to name him after both of them." "James Daniel Lawson," Mary said. "A bridge between our past and our future." "It is perfect," Thomas said, sitting carefully on the bed beside them. "Hello, James Daniel. Welcome to our home." The baby settled against his mother's chest, his cries fading to soft sounds. Thomas wrapped his arms around both of them, and Mary felt complete in a way she had never expected to feel again. The winter passed in a blur of sleepless nights and the joy of new parenthood. Little James was a demanding baby, but Thomas proved to be a natural father, walking the floor with him at night when Mary needed rest, singing old trail songs in a surprisingly pleasant voice. Spring came again, and with it, new growth. The ranch prospered under their careful management. The money from the Colorado sale had been wisely invested, and they were becoming one of the more successful small ranches in the area. One evening in May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while James slept in his cradle inside, Mary leaned against Thomas's shoulder. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked. "If you had ridden past that day instead of stopping." "Every day," Thomas admitted. "And every day I am grateful I stopped. You gave me a reason to settle down, to build something lasting. You gave me a home, Mary." "A real home." "We gave each other that," Mary corrected. "I was living in a tent, barely surviving. You built me a house, but more than that, you showed me I could love again, that I could have a future." Thomas turned to look at her, the setting sun painting her hair gold. "I love you, Mary Lawson, more than I ever thought possible." "I love you too," Mary replied. "And I love the life we have built together." Little James began to fuss inside, and they both smiled. Thomas stood, offering Mary his hand. "Shall we tend to our son in our home?" Mary took his hand and let him pull her up. They walked inside together, to the house that had started as a promise and become a home, to the child that represented their future, to the life they had built brick by brick and board by board. The years that followed were not always easy. There were droughts that tested their resources, hard winters that pushed them to their limits, and the constant challenges of ranch life. But they faced everything together, Thomas and Mary, partners in every sense of the word. When James was 3, they had a daughter, whom they named Sarah Rose, after their friend and neighbor who had become like family. Sarah Jenkins cried when they told her, honored to have the child carry her name. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. The house expanded again, adding more rooms as the family grew. But the original structure remained at the heart of it all, the 2 rooms Thomas had built during those first weeks, the foundation upon which everything else was built. Thomas taught James to ride as soon as the boy was old enough, just as he had been taught by his own father. Mary taught both children to read from her precious books, passing on her love of learning. The children grew up strong and capable, knowing the value of hard work and the importance of family. Sarah Jenkins passed away peacefully in her sleep when James was 10. They mourned her deeply, but Mary found comfort in knowing that Sarah had lived to see the happiness she had predicted come to fruition. More children came over the years. Another son, William, and then twin girls, Elizabeth and Caroline. The house seemed to expand with each new arrival, rooms added as needed, the structure growing organically while maintaining its essential character. Thomas's hair began to show gray at the temples, and Mary found laugh lines around her eyes, but their love only deepened with time. They had the kind of marriage that came from having built something together, from having weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, from choosing each other every day. When James Daniel was 18, he announced his intention to study law in Santa Fe. Mary was proud but apprehensive about her firstborn leaving home. Thomas took her hand and reminded her, "We raised him to be strong and independent. This is what success looks like." The younger children were growing too, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Sarah Rose wanted to be a teacher. William was fascinated by medicine, and the twins could not decide between ranching and opening a shop in town. "We built something good," Mary said one evening, as she and Thomas sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard. "Not just this ranch, but this family." "We did," Thomas agreed, "and it all started with you needing a house and me needing a reason to stop running from my grief." "Do you still miss Rachel?" Mary asked. It was a question she rarely voiced, but after so many years of marriage she felt secure enough to ask. "Sometimes," Thomas admitted. "The same way you sometimes miss James, but I have learned that the heart is big enough to hold more than one love. What I feel for you is not less because I once loved someone else. If anything, having lost once makes me appreciate what we have even more." Mary squeezed his hand. "That is exactly how I feel." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the land they had worked so hard to tame. The house behind them was solid and strong, sheltering 3 generations now, as Thomas's parents had come to live with them after his father's health began to fail. The ranch employed a dozen people by then, a combination of ranch hands, house staff, and seasonal workers. Thomas and Mary had built something that provided not just for their family but for others as well. They were fair employers, remembered what it was like to struggle, and treated their workers with respect and decent wages. When James returned from his studies, he brought with him a wife, a bright young woman named Claire who had also studied law. They settled in Los Alamos, where James opened a practice. He frequently rode out to the ranch, bringing his own children to play in the same yard where he had grown up. Sarah Rose did become a teacher, taking over the one-room schoolhouse in Los Alamos. William went east to study medicine and returned as a qualified doctor, much to the relief of everyone in the county, who no longer had to ride 2 days to see a physician. The twins, in the end, did both of the things they dreamed of. They opened a general store in town but continued to help manage the ranch, splitting their time between the 2 enterprises with the energy and enthusiasm of youth. Thomas and Mary grew older gracefully, their hands becoming more weathered, their steps a bit slower, but their love never diminishing. They became the respected elders of the community, sought out for advice and admired for what they had built. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a celebration at the ranch. The house was filled with family, the yard with friends and neighbors. As Mary looked around at the gathering, at the children running and playing, at the solid walls of the home Thomas had built, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That evening, after everyone had gone home or retired to bed, Thomas and Mary walked out to look at the spot where her tent had once stood. The prairie grass had reclaimed it long ago, but they both remembered. "I was so scared back then," Mary said softly. "Living in that tent, wondering how I was going to survive. And then you rode up, a stranger offering help, and everything changed." "You changed my life too," Thomas said. "I was drifting, unable to settle anywhere because everywhere reminded me of what I had lost. But you gave me a reason to stop drifting. You gave me a home." "We gave each other that," Mary said, as she had said so many times over the years. It was their truth, the foundation of everything they had built. They stood there for a while, two people who had found each other when both were at their lowest, who had built something beautiful from shared loss and hard work and love. The house behind them was lit up, warm and welcoming, filled with the family they had created together. "Should we go in?" Mary finally asked. "It is getting cold." "In a minute," Thomas said, pulling her close. "I want to remember this moment. 30 years since I built you a house and called it our home." "And what a home it has become," Mary said, leaning into his warmth. They walked back together, hands clasped, to the house that had started as a widow's desperate need and a cowboy's determined help, and had become a legacy of love that would last for generations. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and celebrations, by losses and new beginnings. Thomas and Mary's grandchildren grew up hearing the story of how their grandfather had built a house for their grandmother when she was living in a tent, how that act of kindness and determination had sparked a love that transformed both their lives. When Thomas was 68, he fell ill. It was a bad winter, and a cold settled into his chest that would not ease. Mary nursed him day and night, remembering how he had cared for her through all her pregnancies, through illnesses, through difficult times. Their children took turns sitting with him, and the house that he had built was filled with family. On a February morning, with snow falling softly outside the windows he had fitted so carefully decades earlier, Thomas woke from a fitful sleep and looked at Mary sitting beside the bed. His hand found hers, the touch familiar and beloved. "Mary," he said softly, "my Mary." "I am here," she assured him, squeezing his hand gently. "I am right here." "We built something good," he whispered. "A good life, a good home." "We did," Mary said, tears streaming down her face. "The best home, the best life. I love you, Thomas. I have loved you for 33 years, and I will love you for the rest of my life." "I love you too," he said. "Thank you for letting me build you a house. Thank you for making it our home." He closed his eyes then, and Mary held his hand as his breathing slowly eased, becoming shallower and finally stopping altogether. She sat with him for a long time after, remembering the day he had ridden up to her tent, the determination in his eyes as he built their house, the gentleness in his hands as he held their children, the love in his voice every time he said her name. The family buried Thomas on a hill overlooking the ranch, where he could watch over the land he had loved. Mary stood at the graveside, supported by her children, and said goodbye to the man who had given her a second chance at happiness. But even in her grief, Mary knew she had been blessed. She had loved twice in her life, deeply and truly. She had a family that surrounded her with love, a home that stood solid against all storms, and a legacy that would live on through her children and grandchildren. Mary lived for another 15 years after Thomas passed. She remained active in ranch affairs, though her children did most of the physical work. She spent her time with her grandchildren and, eventually, great-grandchildren, passing on stories and wisdom. She never left the house Thomas had built. When her children suggested she might be more comfortable in town, closer to amenities, she refused. "This is my home," she said firmly. "Your father built it for me, and this is where I will stay." On a warm summer evening in 1930, at the age of 72, Mary passed away peacefully in her sleep in the bed she had shared with Thomas for so many years. The family laid her to rest beside him on the hill, two people finally reunited after years apart. The house stood for generations after that, maintained lovingly by their descendants. It became a landmark known as the Lawson House, a testament to what could be built with determination, hard work, and love. The original 2 rooms remained largely unchanged, preserved as they had been when Thomas first completed them, a reminder of where it all began. In And the years that followed, the story of the widow living in a tent and the cowboy who built her a house became family legend, passed down through the generations. Great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren heard about Thomas riding up that day in August 1882, about Mary's strength in the face of loss, about how they fell in love while building a house that became their home. The ranch continued to operate, though it changed with the times, adapting to new methods and technologies while maintaining the core values Thomas and Mary had established. Treat people fairly, work hard, build something lasting, love deeply. The house itself eventually became a museum, carefully preserved by the family and open to the public. Visitors could walk through the rooms, see the furniture Thomas had built, look out the windows at the land that had been so harsh and unforgiving but had yielded to determined effort. They could stand where Mary had once stood, looking at the spot where her tent had been, and imagine the moment when a stranger rode up and changed her life forever. The plaques told the story simply. A widow lived here in a tent after losing everything. A cowboy stopped to help. Together, they built a house. Together, they built a home. Together, they built a love that lasted a lifetime and a legacy that would endure for generations. In the end, that was the story that mattered. Not just that Thomas built Mary a house, though he did. Not just that they fell in love and married, though they did that too. What mattered was that two people, both broken by loss, found each other in the harsh wilderness of the New Mexico territory and chose to build something beautiful together. They chose hope over despair. They chose love over loneliness. They chose to honor their pasts while embracing their future. And in doing so, they created something that transcended the simple act of stacking bricks and nailing boards. They created a home. A real home, built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared work, and deep love. A home that sheltered not just them but their children and their children's children. A home that stood as proof that even in the hardest times, in the harshest places, love could not only survive but thrive. The desert wind still blew across the land, carrying dust and memories. The mountains still loomed purple in the distance. The sun still beat down mercilessly in summer, and the winter winds still howled. But the house stood strong against it all, just as Thomas had built it to do. And if you stood very quietly in the original 2 rooms, some people swore they could feel the presence of the 2 people who had started it all. The widow who refused to give up. The cowboy who offered help and stayed for love. 2 souls who found each other when they needed it most and built something that would outlast them both. That was their legacy. Not just the house, though it stood solid and true. Not just the ranch, though it prospered still. Their real legacy was the proof that love could bloom even in the desert. That home was something you built with your hands and your heart. And that 2 people, working together, could create something that would echo through the generations. The Lawson family continued to gather at the house for reunions, bringing together descendants scattered across the country. They would stand on the porch Thomas had built, walk through the rooms he had so carefully constructed, and tell their children the story of how it all began, with a tent, a widow, a cowboy, and the house that became their home,